This interview was a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted on November 17, 1969. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Mr. Jim Rinehart of Reno, Oklahoma, lawyer and former Oklahoma Legislature. This interview is being re-recorded on July the 3rd, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
I'm visiting today with Mr. Jim Rinehart from Reno, Oklahoma, a lawyer since 1923, member of the Oklahoma Legislature, a member of the Senate and former President Pro Tem of the Oklahoma Senate. Mr. Rinehart, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your parentage and your early life.
Yes, my father was named Hugh F. Rinehart, and my mother was named Mary Rinehart. I was born in Midlothian, Texas. They brought me to the new territory, or new country, north of the Red River, in what was known as the Little Pasture Reservation. And I was raised there on a farm about a mile north of the base line. My background's about the same as any other farm boy at that time. When I reached about 18 years of age, I went to the oil fields and worked at Burkmanette, Texas, and the oil fields in southern Oklahoma. Finished high school. I went to OU, to the law school, and finished there in 1923. Went to El Reno in Canadian County, became assistant county attorney and later county judge.
Now we'll backtrack just a little bit and take a few descriptions, if you may. I wonder if you could describe the country area that you grew up in and some of the roads, the other area, the problems that you had in growing up in contrast with today.
Well, of course, back in the very beginning, there were very few fences, and the roads from towns to other places just were over the prairie. And I remember when fences were first put in, and you had to go around section lines or go through gates through fences. And then gradually, and well, pretty fast, as a matter of fact, the country settled up and the rural schools were established, and sometimes a one-room schoolhouse would have as many as 70 students in it.
Could you describe the early rural schools you attended?
Yes, I attended one at a place called Stage Stand. There's no rural school there anymore, has not been for many years, but it received its name because it had been on an old stage line, and a stand or stopping place had existed somewhere in that neighborhood. That school at one time had as many as 70 or 75 students, and all in a one-room schoolhouse. Taught all 8th grades in the one schoolroom, one teacher.
You worked in the oil fields in southern Oklahoma and in Texas. I wonder if you would describe these fields and the type of work you did, and possibly a little about what was involved in oil fields then compared with today.
Well, then they were drilling with what they call standard rigs. Rotaries had just begun to come into the fields and were not very extensive in their use. The wells were brought in by, well, they called them gushers. When the well was ready to come in, they'd just bring it in, and it would flow oil all over the derrick, all over the slush pits, and all over the ground. They didn't know any other way to do it than that, and of course wasted a lot of oil. Sometimes had some bad fires. They had no drilling or spacing units then. They'd drill wells, just skid rig and drill a well maybe 100 feet from where the first one was. In fact, the old pictures of Burkmanette, it's just a forest of derricks all up and down the streets, all over the town. There was an awful lot of waste in the early oil boom days. They've gotten away from that now with the conservation laws and the proration laws, and are able to preserve the what they call the energy that makes the oil flow out of the ground, and get a great deal more recovery. In the early days of the oil fields, a man might have a mortgaged piece of land and maybe not $100 to his name. They'd drill in a well and he'd get fabulously rich in just a few weeks. And that happened all through the southern oil fields, the oil fields of southern Oklahoma and in North Texas. Burke Burnett was a very good example of it.
Did you say you attended the University of Oklahoma?
Yes.
I wonder if you could describe the University of Oklahoma at the time you attended.
Yes, I thought then was a very big place. It was very small in comparison to what it is now. The law school, we call the law barn then, is not much improved from what it was then. There hadn't been very much money spent on the law school insofar as buildings are concerned, but they've always had a very good high-grade law school at OU. When I attended, the two leading schools were the School of Engineering and the School of Geology. The law school and the other colleges were down the list, but geology was a very popular subject around 1918-19.
You served as a county judge when you were fairly young, only a couple of years out of college. I wonder if you could tell us about the problems of a judge in a town at that time, and possibly some of the more interesting lawsuits you may have had under you.
Well, at that time we had the prohibition law in Oklahoma, and we had a sort of a depression on, and there were a lot of men that were really good citizens, wouldn't violate any other law, that did violate the prohibition law by engaging in the manufacture of corn whiskey up and down the rivers and canyons of the state. And the county court had the exclusive jurisdiction of the enforcement of the prohibition law. And most of our terms of court were jury trials of men charged with violations of the prohibition law, and then probate law and things of that kind, but most of it that got the public notice was the trial of what we used to call moonshiners and bootleggers.
Without mentioning any names necessarily, can you think of any unusual cases that might be of interest
At this point, there is an unexplainable gap in the master tape, but we pick up the interview when the master tape continues. The gap is approximately 36 seconds long.
The liquor that was seized by the officer was intoxicating liquor. Generally, that was done by just asking him if he tasted it and discovered that it was corn whiskey. And he'd always answer, yes, he did, and that it was corn whiskey. I remember one instance of a deputy sheriff testifying to that, and the defense lawyer asked him if there's anything peculiar about the taste of it. He said, yes, it had a little tarry taste. They were trying a colored lady, and she took the stand and testified in her own defense. She never drank any intoxicating liquors of any kind, but that her doctor had told her to use it for rheumatiz that she had, and that actually this liquor that they found was the liquor that she used by standing in a dishpan and pouring it over her body, and that she took that treatment once a week and poured the liquor into a fruit jar, and that's what the officers had seized. But it hadn't been used and was not used for beverage purposes at all. Well, the jury very promptly acquitted her, of course.
wonder if you could tell us a little about your movement into the legislative area and your first Senate campaign. I believe this was 1934. Is this correct? Could you tell a little about that?
Well, I don't suppose it was any different from any other campaigns at that time. The issues then were question of homestead exemption, which we did not have, homestead exemption from taxes, question of old age pensions, which we did not have, the matter of school legislation, and schools then were sadly neglected, much worse than now, and the usual problems that Oklahoma's had eternally, it looks like, and that was a search for money to finance the operation of government.
You went into the Senate, I believe, in 1934. You later were President Pro Tem and floor leader. I wonder if you might tell us some of the, or recall what you feel are some of the more fiery moments in the Senate or in the legislature.
The enactment of the homestead exemption was one. It was brought about in a special session which Governor Marlin had called in November, and that special session ran until midnight of the day that the next regular session was to come into assemblage. And the act was passed just a few minutes before that session would have died, just by the operation of the calendar. Then there were hot moments on toll road legislation. That was always hotly contested. The adoption of the, what we call the anti-loan shark law, was very hotly contested. There were a number of very hotly contested measures before the legislature during that 24 years.
What would you say was the most exciting thing that happened in the legislature during this period? Maybe legislatively, or maybe something, maybe some incident that may have occurred.
Well, you have to answer this in the light of what the people think was the most exciting, and everybody, of course, agrees that the shooting of Tom Anglin on the Senate floor by a member of the House of Representatives was the most exciting, and probably that was correct.
Can you describe this? Were you on the floor at that time?
No, I was not. It was during the noon recess, and I was not there. I was in an office adjacent to the Senate, but I didn't see any of it. I heard the pistol shots and was there, of course, immediately afterwards, but I didn't see any of it at all.
Can you think of any other exciting instances? This is certainly one. Can you think of any other exciting instances that might be worth mentioning?
Yes, when we enacted the death benefit law, Senate had been in session about 18 hours, and it was late in the night, or I should say early in the morning following the previous day, and was the day of adjournment. The clock was covered, and there was about 4 hours of argument. They say that argument seldom changes any votes, but it did on that occasion, and it passed by one vote, and was probably as hard fought as any piece of legislation that I ever witnessed and or took part in. And it must have been good, because it's still a law without any amendment.
What do you feel is the among the bills that you may have either authored or had an influence, an important influence on, were the most significant part of your career?
I think the budget balancing amendment in Governor Ed Phillips' administration that made this state's credit worth something. It wasn't worth anything then. They're about a year and a half behind paying their bills, and their warrants were non-payable. The budget balancing amendment, I think, is top. The Board of Regents for Higher Education, I'd say, was next. Then we came into Bob Kerr's administration. He created an advisory pardon and parole board. It was new ground and experimental, and there'd been trouble in every governor's administration with pardons and paroles. It had corrupted the whole system and was always a bad thing to deal with. But when Governor Turner became governor, it was made a constitutional amendment, and he set it up, appointed the board, pardon and parole board. That was in 1947. It's functioned well since then. There has not been one single scandal connected with pardon and paroles during that period of time, which was really turning the corner for Oklahoma. The Highway Patrol, the creation of the Highway Patrol was important legislation. Governor Roy Turner's 8-man Highway Commission was a great step in advancement. The toll road legislation permitting the building of toll roads and the paying for them by the traveling public was an advance. There were a number of very important things during that period of time.
You were involved considerably in the apportionment legislation in legally, I think, and I wondered if, and in this fight, I wonder if you might recount a little bit of this controversy.
I was not really involved in the legislation. During the time that I was in the legislature, the courts had held that that was a political question to be decided by the legislative bodies, and the courts stayed out of it. They called it a briar thicket or something of that kind, and they stayed out of it. But after I had left the legislature, there was a case that went to the United States Supreme Court from Georgia, in which they held that the court could and would and did go into the field of legislation as a court matter and determine under the 14th Amendment whether or not there was equal representation when a county, we'll say, or a subdivision of government of 10,000 people elected a man to the legislature, and another subdivision of government of 20,000 people could only elect one. And they held that the man in the county of 20,000 people was not equally represented, and under the one vote, one man, one vote principle, they decreed judicial reapportionment.
Mr. Rinehart, I wonder if you have any thoughts for young people entering the field of politics.
I would encourage it very much. There's not much reward for service in the legislature. I mean by that you'll sacrifice a lot of time from your business, a lot of time from your family, and now with the sessions every year, it makes it a real burden. I think it's probably too much of a burden, and you're getting away from a citizens' legislature and getting to where men have to be almost professionals. But in any event, I would encourage all young people to take part in the legislature.
There is no sign-off for this interview. It simply ends in mid-sentence. There is no indication that this interview is continued on any other tape, and there is no more material of this interview anywhere else on this particular Living Legend reel-to-reel tape.